All right. Well, today on the show, we are excited to talk to Ken Shigematsu. Ken, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's an honor to talk to you. Ken, you've written just some phenomenal books: God, My Everything, Survival Guide for the Soul. You're a pastor in Canada. But for anybody that might be watching this or listening to this, and maybe they've never heard your story, I would love for you to share just a little bit of your story, how you went from a Fortune 500 company in Tokyo to a pastor in Canada. And both of those things, they sound completely different, but there were some things happening maybe underneath the surface in your own life that you saw were similar. And what did that ultimately lead you to?
Yeah, Mark. Yeah, you mentioned I work for a Fortune 500. I was with the Sony Corporation in Tokyo, and I was what they call the 7-Eleven man. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this expression. It doesn't mean that I had a lot of Slurpees, although I had Slurpees from time to time, but it meant that my workday literally went from 7 in the morning till 11 at night, sometimes even later. So things were really crazy. I enjoyed my life and work, even though it was really busy. But I sensed that God might have something else for me. So I ended up going to seminary just north of Boston. And I ended up eventually back in Vancouver, Canada. And I wasn't sure if I should go back to the corporate world or pursue a vocation of some kind of full-time ministry. And as I was fasting and praying on day 3 of a fast, the words 10th Avenue Alliance came really clearly to mind. And then the words senior pastor on day 5 came clearly to mind. This doesn't happen to me very often. I thought it was odd. I had no connection with this church in a formal way. And I went to visit the church in Vancouver. I walked in, and my first thought was, this church is filled with white Anglo-Saxon senior citizens. Nothing wrong with that, but I felt that I was too young. I was in my 20s and not white enough, not Caucasian enough to pastor this church. And already had a pastor. I didn't mention to the pastor at the time that I had this sense through fasting and prayer. I didn't want him to think I was after his job. But we had lunch, and he said, look, there are no kids my kids' ages. I'm planning to move on. If you're thinking about pastoral ministry, you should put your name in the hat. I did, and God ended up confirming the sense of guidance I had through the fasting and prayer. And that was about 25 years ago. And so I see God's hand in that.
Yeah. And one of the things that you write about in the book is that so there you are in Tokyo working the 7-Eleven man, and then you
Mm-hmm.
become the pastor of this church. And underneath the surface in your own heart, there was still the busyness, and there are all of these things that just the similarities of the two. Could you talk about that maybe a little bit? Just what was happening in your own heart, even as you made that transition from the corporate world, Fortune 500, to being a pastor?
Yeah, I thought things would settle down for me as a pastor, especially in a place like Vancouver, Canada, on the West Coast. I had come to a church, 10th Church had cycled through 20 pastors in 20 years and had gone from over 1,000 people in its heyday back in the 1950s to 100 and something. And on one of my first days on the job, the secretary walked into my office and she said, Ken, if the ship sinks now, meaning the church, everyone will blame you because you were the last captain at the helm. I think she was trying to motivate me to work harder. That just stressed me out and filled me with all kinds of feelings of insecurity. And I was working a lot of late nights. You have Wendy's in Kentucky, the fast food restaurant. I was making stops at the Wendy's drive-through. The person behind the glass came to recognize me by face and by name. I was working hard, but I was unhappy. The church wasn't going well. And I really felt like I needed a change in my life, a new direction.
And was it that change, that desire that you were going through? Was it that led you to what you call in the books the monastic way, to contemplative spirituality?
Yeah, Mark, that I think prepared me for that. And during this time where I felt like I was constantly treading water, my mentor at Leighton Ford, who's now based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, and the brother-in-law to the late Billy Graham, invited me to join him on a pilgrimage to the holy places of Ireland. I had never been to Ireland. Ireland is not the old country for me. I'm originally from Japan. but I was tired and eager for a change of scenery and a change of pace. And so with a small group, we ended up visiting the ancient monasteries of Ireland and learned from the monks about this way of life that they describe as a rule of life. It was a kind of life rhythm that enabled the monks to experience God as alive and real, not just as they were praying in a chapel, but as they were working out in the fields, as they were studying in a library, as they were preparing a meal in a kitchen. And I was desperate to experience God as alive and real in every part of my life. So I returned here to Vancouver and I began to put into practice some of the simple habits I learned from the monks. And over time, these habits awakened me to God in a fresh way and would go on to change my life.
And would you say that everything around you was still basically at the same pace that it was, but under the surface you had, I guess we could say, a new operating system, that this monastic way had kind of begun to get rooted in you and change the way that you interacted in the world? What was it about that monastic way, those contemplative rhythms? What was it about that really started to make a difference in your heart, even though everything around you might still be working at the same pace?
Yeah, so we were still facing the challenges of being an urban church in the city with lots of turnover. There were still expectations on me from certain people at the church, but I had a new peace. I began to take Sabbath. That became part of my own rule or rhythm of life. And even though there was more work to be done, in my opinion, than could be done in 7 days in any given week, on Mondays, I stopped working and took time. I was single then to run through the forest or to mountain bike ride, swim, maybe kayak. I took time to meditate on God's word in the morning, might watch a movie in the evening. But it became a day to connect with God, a very life-giving experience. And I later learned that Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, says that if you keep a Sabbath once a week, you'll experience the other 6 days of your week differently. And so even though, if you've mentioned that we had a bunch of challenges as a church still ahead of us, I was experiencing a new peace thanks to practices like Sabbath and silent meditation.
I've heard that story. Obviously, your story is unique, but I've heard variations of that story from so many ministry leaders. They were facing a lot of pressure. They went through a lot of burnout, and it was through that burnout that somehow God brought along to their path these monastic ways, this contemplative spirituality, and they just found it transformative. What is it about these practices that, I mean, people who are watching, listening, a good chunk of them are leaders. But even no matter what context you find yourself, what is it about those practices that are so transformative in a world that is just nonstop, go, 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 always pressure to perform?
Yeah, part of it is that it helps to center us. I'm a very easily distracted kind of person. Even as I've heard the ping go off recently, I can be distracted. I'm not a contemplative person, Mark, by nature. I was just trying to figure out how to turn that off. But I have found that if I take some time in the morning, and this is a monastic practice for silence, it stills me in a profound way. So for example, this morning, I began my day with a run with our golden retriever, Sasha. So that's also part of my simple rhythm of life. I run or swim. I come back home, I light a candle, and I take some time to sit, breathing deeply in through my nose, exhaling slowly, breathing in deeply, exhaling slowly. And then I'll start to wonder, Mark, how much time has gone by anyway? So I'll look for my phone, not to check my messages or even my schedule for the day, but to open up a free app called Centering Prayer. The app has a timer. So I'll set the timer to maybe 15 or 20 minutes and then hit begin on the app. chime sounds as though I were in a monastery being summoned by a monk, clinging the bell to pray. Continue to breathe deeply. In through my nose, exhale slowly through my nose. And then, Mark, I'll start to think of all the things I'm supposed to do today, like whatever, finish a report, talk to a new friend like yourself on a podcast or whatever it is, a meeting that I've got later, some errands to run. And so I'll reach for my Bible or maybe just choose a passage that I'm familiar with. And every time my mind wanders, I'll repeat the passage to myself. Be still and know that I am God. I'm distracted again. Be still. Or maybe simply be in the presence of God. And I know this might sound like a lot of work to folks, but let me shift the scenery for a moment. I'm a person who lives in Vancouver, so it's a coastal city. We're on the water. I love being on the water, whether it's kayaking or on a friend's sailboat. I don't actually own a sailboat. And there have been times when I've been out at sea, Mark, and I have seen salmon jumping out of the water at a 45-degree angle. I've seen, on rare occasions, pods of dolphins or whales in the distance. And there are times when I'm sitting in the presence of God and I feel surrounded by the beautiful mystery that upholds me and the whole world. But there have also been times when I've been out at sea and I've seen a film of oil on the surface of the water, or an empty Coke bottle bobbing up and down, or some debris. And there are times when I'm sitting in silence in God's presence and anxiety rises up in my heart. Or maybe a painful memory or a feeling of anger or frustration or envy towards someone. I lift those up to the Lord and I feel freer of them. I feel lighter. When the 15 or 20 minutes are done, chime sounds, I open my eyes, and I always feel just a little bit lighter afterwards, and throughout the day, a little bit more focused on Jesus and aware of his love for me. It's not like that I'm not distracted again, I am, but there's a greater degree of focus and peace. And so monastic practices like Sabbath keeping or centering silent prayer awaken us to a more direct experience, felt experience of God's presence. So, yeah.
And I think one of the misconceptions that people may have when they hear us use that word, monastic, they think of a monk. I think one of the misconceptions that people may have is that we are talking about things to help us to get away from the world. The world is so busy, it's so distracted. The world is, there's so much brokenness. We're just trying to get away from the world. Is this misconception? But really, these kind of practices are to help you go into the world in a new way to serve it. Is that right? Can you unpack that? You talk about that in the book. I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a bit of a misconception that monks have an idyllic life. Monks make some of the best chocolate and cheese here in the world. Thomas Merton, famous monk, had a strong connection to your great state of Kentucky, of course. These practices can help move us into the world. Some people feel, Mark, that a practice like meditative prayer is very self-absorbed and navel-gazing, that it might be equivalent to going to a spa or getting a massage. Nothing necessarily wrong with those things, but as you've just implied, this kind of practice helps us give more. My friend, Dr. Hilary McBride, has a PhD from UBC in psychology. She is a clinical counselor and a psychologist. And she points out that if you meditate between 15 to 20 minutes a day for between 4 to 6 weeks, and then a disabled person walks into the room, you will be like 100 times more likely to respond to that person. Meditation not only helps us center, but it causes us to be more empathetic, more connected to God and to others. So that's part of the paradox of it.
Is there a difference, say, between these kind of contemplative rhythms versus the way that just the average person might think about spiritual discipline, spiritual growth? Is there a difference between these kind of rhythms and the way that somebody might just think about just normal spiritual growth? Go to church, read your Bible, those kind of things?
Yeah, when we think about, say, a contemplative monastic practice and way that a typical person might think of an avenue towards spiritual growth, the difference in nuance is that contemplative comes from the two Latin root words, cum, which means with, and temple, the root word temple, and we know what that means, to attend to God's presence, to attend to God's face, as David writes about in Psalm 27. And so traditional spiritual disciplines and contemplative practices on the surface may seem very similar. Read your Bible, serve, evangelize. But the emphasis of contemplative practice is to use these practices as a gateway to experience God's face directly. And so the practices aren't ends in and of themselves, but they are a gateway to the presence of God.
Yeah. One of the things that you talk about in Survival Guide for the Soul is you talk about these two Adams, Adam 1 and Adam 2. You talk about, you call it the divided self. Can you talk about what that means? What do you mean by the divided self?
Yeah, so in Survival Guide for the Soul, which you just referenced, I think somewhere early in the book, I'm thankful that you read it. I'm actually drawing on the work of a rabbi named Joseph Solzhenitsyn, who looked at Genesis 1 and thought, okay, in Genesis 1, there is a certain portrayal of Adam. He is called to fill the earth and subdue it. And so in modern terms, I call this Adam, striving Adam. He wants to create businesses, or she wants to conquer disease, control the world. And we need striving Adam. That's part of who we are. We need that ambition to go out and get them, like you Americans love to say. But in Genesis 2, Rabbi Solzhenitsyn notices that there is a different portrayal of Adam. He's called to a garden to humbly serve it. He walks with God in the cool of the day. He's lonely until Eve appears. And so I call this Adam, portrayed in Genesis 2, as soulful Adam, the Adam inside us that longs to connect with God and others. And our society, whether it's the USA, Japan, where I'm from originally, and even Canada, which is considered a more laid-back country, puts the emphasis on striving Adam. If you honor striving Adam alone and never take Sabbath, you might get promoted. You're breaking one of the 10 commandments, but you might get promoted. Probably won't get a lot of fanfare for cultivating your soul, but it will serve the most important values of our life as we connect with God, as we attend to our families and the people that are most valuable to us.
And so how do we bring those together, this divided self?
Yeah, I feel that the way we bring those together is through what the monastics call a rule of life, which I mentioned earlier. And the word rule, as some of your friends on this podcast may know, shares a Latin root with the word trellis. Rule can mean trellis. And a trellis is simply, as many of your friends would know, is a structure that supports a grapevine in a vineyard, enabling it to receive more sunlight, to be pruned and guided in its growth so that it produces better fruit. And so I believe the way to integrate striving Adam and soulful Adam is to construct a way of life that connects us deeply to God and to the light of God's face, but also propels us into the world to work hard, to make a contribution and difference through whatever it is we're called to do.
And so that is, so what you're just describing there, that is the point of God in my everything. You unpack how to create a rule of life. I would love to just really get specific. This might be a new concept. Somebody that's listening to this and, watching this, they've never heard of it, or maybe they're just not familiar with it. I would love to just really get specific. So a rule of life is not simply, it includes those spiritual disciplines that we may think of, but a lot of times we may have those spiritual disciplines and then we're done. And so then I can go on with the rest of my life, and almost they're kind of divided. They're isolated. Here's my spiritual life. Here, we have this disconnected life. But a rule of life is literally God in my everything, trying to bring God into every aspect of my life. I would love to hear, what does that rule of life look like for you?
Yeah, Mark, I've already mentioned a couple of practices. One is Sabbath. This is especially for those of us who tend to be workaholics by nature. Sabbath enables us to not only experience rest and joy in God and in people, but it also enables us to work from a place of rest, not desperately needing to rest from work. And so Sabbath is part of my rhythm. As I also briefly alluded to earlier, exercise is part of my rhythm. So I begin my day either with a run with our golden retriever or a swim at a nearby pool. And I'm not trying to impose this on anyone else, but I find that when I exercise, I feel better. I know that as I exercise, endocannabinoids are being released in my brain, which mimic cannabis. And obviously that's a kind of legal mimicking. Endorphins are released in my brain. And that seems to help me feel more centered and more connected to God and people outside of the time of exercise. And then, as I mentioned, I engage in silent, prayerful meditation, which also helps me connect with others. There was a guy named Andrew who, in some ways, is a lot like me, very easily distracted. He worked as an engineer, and he began to experiment with some meditation. And after a little while, he said, "This isn't working for me. Every time I try to sit in silence, I get distracted." He was about to quit. Then Andrew thought to himself, "But on the days I meditate, when I'm in line at the cafeteria and I want to order something deep fried and salty, I tend to make a healthier eating choice. And the days I meditate, when there's something really sarcastic about to fly off the tip of my tongue, on those days, I'm more likely to bite my tongue. And on the days I meditate, when I'm distracted at work, which I am a lot, I'm able to more easily refocus on my work." And so these things may sound somewhat superficial. Our eating choices, how we treat people, whether we're present at school or work or not, or ministry. But practices like meditation and the spiritual practices that connect us to God impact every part of our life. There will be an integration that happens. We will experience God in our everything.
Yeah, I just wouldn't want people to miss that here you are talking about your rule of life and how you're bringing God into your everything. And one of those is running. And I love to run, and I'm a runner, but I can remember, I thought about this when I was reading your book. I can remember a conversation that I had with, this was years ago. Even, I didn't know rule of life language or anything like that, but the Bible, Paul will say, glorify God, whatever you do, do it for the glory of God, And so you may talk about something like running. I can remember a conversation that I had, somebody, an exercise came up and they asked, how in the world can you exercise for God's glory? How can you exercise with God? How is that a spiritual practice? And so maybe somebody is thinking that. Can you just talk about that? How is that an act that you are doing before the Lord?
Well, first of all, you're honoring God in your body. And if your friends have seen the movie Chariots of Fire, Eric Liddell, this Olympic runner, says, "When I run, I feel his pleasure." And I think that people sometimes feel that spiritual practices, disciplines must be hard and arduous. But I really believe that any practice that, whether it's overtly spiritual or religious or not, that makes you come alive over time is spiritual practice. So whatever makes you come alive. And let me say this along those lines. If you decide to construct a rule of life, maybe you pick up a copy of God in My Everything or a similar resource, and you construct a trellis, and then your life starts feeling, heavier and more burdensome. It's almost certainly a self-constructed routine that you've created. Because if your rhythm is spirit inspired, if the trellis has been encouraged by Christ, your life won't feel like, my life is so much heavier. It'll feel like I'm going to just get on a chair here. I can't really see myself on the screen because I've turned my self screen off, but it'll feel like, oh, my life feels supported. It feels lighter. It feels freer. And it's not to say that practices don't require discipline, but you will find that as you are more connected to the vine of Christ, that your life will feel lighter and freer.
Yeah, I just love that image there. It's just this integrated life. And so it's not isolated. We're not these divided people where our spiritual lives are over here in a corner. And I think what you just touched on with that illustration, how this rule supports our life. Is that what you mean in the book when you say that a rule of life is not one more thing to do?
Exactly. Yes. So it's not about, checking a box. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for humankind, not man or woman for the Sabbath. And similarly, a rule of life is meant to serve us, to support us and our life with God and the most important aspects of our life. So it shouldn't feel like a burden. One more thing to do. It should feel like, oh, this gives me life. And so even with meditation, I find that if I've got an unusually busy day or I'm facing down some crucial conversation, some heavy crisis, I feel like I need a little bit more time of meditation and silence, because I know that'll make me more creative, more clear, more connected to God. And if I need to be more courageous and bold.
Yeah, I would love to ask you a question about meditation. I know one of the things that when I talk to people about, meditation, silence and solitude and that sort of thing, the question that comes up is, what do I do when I'm distracted? And so what do I do when my mind wanders? What do you do when you are in those times and your mind just begins to wander? Is there a prayer that you begin to pray, breath prayer, those kind of things? What do you do?
Yeah, so what I do is I will use the sacred word, usually from scripture. So it might be, as I mentioned, be still and know that I am God, or be still, or recently it's simply been love from, 1 Corinthians 13 and from the Gospels, just love. I use that word to help focus me. I'll also sometimes focus intentionally on my breath, breathing in through my nose and then exhaling through my nose. And I'll start to count if I'm really distracted. So breathing in 1, exhale 2, breathing in 3, exhale 4, up to 10. So I'm not thinking of a number that's too high. And here's something to keep in mind. Every time you're distracted, it gives us an opportunity to turn back to the Lord. So Thomas Keating, who was considered a great teacher of meditation, said, if you're distracted 10,000 times in your meditative prayer, you have 10,000 opportunities to return to Jesus. So let's practice returning. And so, don't feel despair. It's an opportunity for growth when we're distracted to turn back.
Yeah, Ken, as we're wrapping up, one of the things, here we are at the back end of 2021, and just after everything that's been experienced past 2 years with a pandemic and political tension, racial tension, so many things happening in the world. One of the things that a lot of people have noted is that it looks as if there is a crisis of discipleship in the church, that the church, so many followers of Jesus, we've almost been shaped by other things than Jesus, by the scriptures. Why do you think this is such an important moment for the church to catch this vision of God in my everything?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think that you're absolutely right. We're living in a time of great chaos and stress because of the pandemic, but it's also a time when people are divided over political identities, as you would well know in the state of Kentucky, and we feel that here in Canada. So all kinds of issues. So I feel that there is a desperate need for us to become more like Jesus, to have his heart, his character, his tone. And when we experience God in our everything, that will truly transform us. Dallas Willard, the great philosopher and writer on the spiritual life, once said to a pastor, it wasn't me, but another pastor, how can I encourage discipleship in my church? And Dallas said to this pastor I know, organize your life so that you are experiencing maximum joy, contentment, and confidence in God in your everyday life.
Hmm.
And the pastor said, Dallas, I wasn't asking for myself. I was asking for my church. And Dallas said, okay, I'll respond for your church. Organize your life in such a way that you are experiencing maximum joy, contentment, and confidence in God in your everyday life. And as we organize our life with the inspiration of the Spirit so that we're experiencing contentment and joy and confidence in God, that will change us. That will help us be tethered to Christ. And as that happens, I think we'll influence others to do the same.
Ken, this has been so good. Ken, thank you so much for taking some time to jump on the podcast today. This has been great. Now, the books are Survival Guide for the Soul, God in My Everything. We're going to make sure we've got links for those in the show notes where people can pick those up. Ken, is there any other way that people can maybe connect with you online?
Our website is www.tenth.ca, and my personal email is on our staff page. So if people want to interact, I'd be glad to connect.
That's great. That's great. Ken, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been an honor to talk to you.
Yeah, it's been an honor to talk to you, Mark. Thanks so much for having me.